It is now. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for the introduction. I appreciate it. So it's nice to see so many of you that I am acquainted with, and thanks for coming. Yeah, Daniel and I put together this book. Since we're here, I'll show you the cover. And it took us a couple years to do it, but it was well worth it, I believe, in the end. I'll just give you a little scope, an overview of what we try to cover in the book, and then I'm going to turn it over to Daniel to give some new material on critical theory, and then I will end with also a brief paper. And if I could just request, please, that you would put your microphones on mute during the talks. That way there won't be any interruption. And then when, if you want, please, if you have some thoughts that you'd like to dialogue with, feel free to put them in the chat or to write them down, and then we'll have hopefully a long time for having discussion about the papers. But what we decided to do is that instead of having a book only focus upon, let's say, the Frankfurt School, we wanted to show a progression from the early days of critical theory, as well as progressing to contemporary times and topics. So we start with Joel Whitebook, who many of you probably know is quite a well-respected psychoanalyst and critical theorist. He begins our journey by giving us a nice overview of the origins of the School for Social Research and the Frankfurt School personnel from, Horkheimer and Adorno, Marcuse, and then progressing into second generation Habermas critical theorists, and then third generation where Axel Honneth and Joel Whitebook himself have dialogued. So it's a nice introduction to the field and how it relates to psychoanalytic thinking. Then we have a progression where philosopher Adrian Johnson talks about Marx and Freud and the role of aggression. And then Frank Pittenger takes up Freud and the Frankfurt School, and we are continuing that theme. Then we segue into analytical philosophy. So Paul Bishop is looking at Jung and the dialectic of the Enlightenment. Myself and Daniel have two chapters. I'm looking at the concept of disrecognition, meaning taking up recognition theory, which I'm going to talk about a little bit today, and its role in suffering. We have two papers on anti-Semitism. One is from Benjamin Strasberg, who's looking at critical theory of anti-Semitism and its implications in politics, education, and psychoanalysis. And then Daniel also is looking at more of a left-wing authoritarianism and anti-Semitism. Now, I should say that Daniel also has another chapter called Mapping the White Unconscious, Critical Race Theory, Whiteness Studies, and Psychoanalysis. Now, this particular chapter was quite controversial because when we shared it with other members, people decided to drop like flies. They didn't want to have anything to do with the book. Now, I've never encountered that in my entire life, that academics would not want to be associated with another person's work. but it tells you how controversial things are in today's world, where we can't critique what we might consider to be, left or illiberal left authoritarian politics. And we see this today in a number of movements, whether it be wokeism, critical race theory, critical social justice, and how it's making its way into the therapy politics. But given that we don't care how other people think, we decided to plug away anyway. And many other noteworthy contributors have stayed on. Another analytical contribution to analytical philosophy is by Gary Clark. And he's looking at evolution or evolutionary anthropology in the work of Erich Fromm, and tying that into various Jungian dimensions. Jungian analyst John White from Pittsburgh also contributed a good chapter on what he calls colonizing the American psyche, virtue and the problem of consumer capitalism. So he's looking at the role of capital in today's societies. Another philosopher named Robert Fowler, who's in Austria, and is also known for his work on the pleasure principle and culture. He offered a chapter on more or less Freudian theory and its relation to materialism. And then Kurt Jacobson offered a very nice critique of the postmodern movement within critical theory and psychoanalytic thinking. I end off with the implications that critical theory, or I should say, the implications that contemporary psychoanalysis has for critical theory, because often critical theorists, they only engage Freud. They really have very little knowledge of contemporary psychoanalytic thinking. So I felt that was important to include. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Burston and let him take over. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Okay, everybody. I think I can safely assume that everyone who's present today knows what psychoanalysis is, but the same may not be true of critical theory, which has acquired a very bad reputation in some quarters. Why? I think it's because of decades of promiscuous usage in which the term critical theory was thoughtlessly and indiscriminately applied to theoretical school and philosophical schools and to social movements that promote positions that are actually antithetical in some ways to the founder of critical theories, to the founder's original outlooks and intentions. And as a result of this decades-long slide into semantic sort of confusion of tongues, there's many misconceptions abroad. Many people on the right today use the term critical theory indiscriminately to refer to all the social movements and ideologies that they fear or imagine threaten the fabric of Western civilization. And conversely, people on the left mistakenly believe that critical theory is an approach to social theory that includes an extremely diverse group of thinkers, stretching all the way, say, from Antonio Gramsci in the 1920s to Jacques Derrida and Judith Butler in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Now, underlying both of these commonplace misconceptions is a trope that's seldom articulated but widely shared by people on the left and the right, and it goes something like this. Marxism begat critical theory begat postmodernism, postmodernism in turn begat all these contemporary social movements like critical race theory, queer theory, decolonial theory, and so on. Now, for anyone who's made a serious study of critical theory, this thumbnail genealogy doesn't ring true. Critical theory was never intended to undermine or corrode Western civilization, but to address its shortcomings and its failures to live up to its highest ideals, and to promote democracy and human welfare, to prevent, and above all, perhaps to prevent the slide into barbarism that the first generation of critical theorists witnessed firsthand in Weimar in the 1930s. Nor is critical theory, nor does it consist of a pantheon of left-leaning academics who have a nodding acquaintance with the Frankfurt School, but who perversely associate their ideas and aspirations with those of postmodern thinkers in a flagrantly syncretistic and often absurd fashion. Critical theory has been quite critical of postmodernism consistently since it first showed up in the early 1960s. So what exactly is critical theory? And what is its relationship to psychoanalysis? And after that, we'll get to the Jungian dimension. Critical theory, in the sense that I'm talking about, is intimately and inextricably tied to the ideas and efforts of the Frankfurt School for Social Research, which has spawned 3 generations of theorists. Just for the sake of clarity and convenience, I'm going to focus on the first generation, which includes people like Walter Benjamin, Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse, Erich Fromm, Leo Lowenthal, and Theodor Adorno. To put the efforts of the first generation of critical theorists into historical perspective, please consider the following. In 1794, the Marquis de Condorcet wrote a book entitled Sketch for a Historical Picture of the Progress of the Human Mind. This was the very first book-length treatment on the subject of progress to appear in print. Condorcet was a leading figure in the French Enlightenment, and he depicted progress as a slow but inexorable, unstoppable process that would eventually dispel ignorance and superstition through the dissemination of literacy, public education, and the development of science and technology, and in the process, confer previously undreamt of moral and material benefits on humankind. Eventually ending poverty, abolishing slavery, and granting women full legal and political equality with men. This was in 1794. At its inception, in the late 1840s, Marxism was really a radical extension of the French Enlightenment program. But it was predicated on a belief, a strong belief in progress, and it attempted to create a program, as it were, for universal human emancipation. But while Marx shared the Enlightenment's belief in equality, he stipulated that progress, though slow, is never a simple or a linear or an easy process. On the contrary, according to Marx, progress is marked by exploitation and oppression, class conflict, and class struggle. Marx believed that the working class had a special role to play in bringing about a better world, and would soon acquire something that he called class consciousness, that would enable members of the working class all around the globe to collaborate together to bring about a classless society and the emancipation of all humankind, not just of the bourgeoisie. That never happened. Okay, let's be candid. That never happened. In fact, in 1929, almost a century on from the inception of Marxism, in 1929, the stock market crashed, the biggest crisis in capitalism to that point, and the proletariat did not rise to the occasion, did not mount the revolution that Marx had predicted that it would and that it must in order to effect this transition to a classless society. So critical theory, in the first instance, arose primarily as a response to the failure of Marx's predictions on this score, and the realization that the proletariat was not likely to play, the working class was not likely to play the role that Marx had scripted for it historically. But this was a gradual process. This didn't happen overnight. The founder of the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research was Felix Weil, a pupil of the Marxist philosopher Karl Korsch. Korsch was notable for breaking away from Moscow and the orthodox Leninist line and starting to take an interest in what Marxists sort of derisively and dismissively referred to as cultural issues. But his pupil, Felix Weil, set things in motion at the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research with an endowment from his wealthy father, an Argentinian Jewish businessman. The Frankfurt Institute's first director, Karl Grünberg, was a protege of Henrik Grossman, a committed Marxist with working class roots. Grünberg took charge in 1924, which was well before Hitler's ascendancy to power seemed assured to most observers. But the Institute's second director, Max Horkheimer, took charge in 1930, 1 year after the stock market crash, when Hitler's eventual triumph, seemed increasingly likely to many thoughtful observers, among them the young Erich Fromm, who already in 1930 was warning his colleagues of Hitler's eventual rise to power. The year that Horkheimer became director of the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, 1930, is also the year that Sigmund Freud published Civilization and Its Discontents. According to Freud, social and cultural cohesion in any period of history, just by virtue of human nature, social and cultural cohesion is only achieved through the domestication and the secondary transformation of our raw instinctual drives, creating a good deal of sexual privation and anguish, sexual anguish in the process. And this had a dual effect. On the one hand, it rendered everyone what Freud called an enemy of civilization in the depths of their unconscious. On the other hand, it produced prodigious scientific and technical accomplishments. So the sacrifices made on behalf of civilization gave us immense powers over nature, which were godlike, to use Freud's term, and were completely undreamt of by our ancestors, except in myths and stories. But Freud warned us that these same powers can be harnessed in the service of our innate aggression. Indeed, his main critique of Marxist thought is that it consistently underestimates or simply ignores this facet of human nature. And beyond that, he warned that unless or until we learn to harness and deflect our instinctive aggression, we face the prospect of technologically self-inflicted extinction that we, because as science advances, so do weapons of mass destruction. This is years before the atomic bomb was actually a thing, before it was a reality. But Freud anticipated developments like these. Nowadays, few people would dispute that Freud's warning at the time was prophetic, but when the Frankfurt School, under Max Horkheimer's leadership, heaped praise on Freud's book and helped to award him the Frankfurt's Goethe Prize in Literature, Orthodox Marxists were appalled. Undeterred by their misgivings and their critiques, Horkheimer coined the term critical theory in 1930 to describe the Institute's orientation and to differentiate their evolving approach from Orthodox Marxism. And of course, the main feature of critical theory was that it was attempted to effect a synthesis of Marx and Freud in order to account for the failure of the working class to play the role that Marx had scripted for it almost 100 years previously in his thoughts about the worldwide revolution. But in addition to integrating psychoanalysis, critical theory rejected classical Marxism's economic determinism. It promoted interdisciplinarity and it integrated ideas from thinkers like Max Weber and other theorists in sociology, anthropology, philosophy, literature. In the process of developing this sort of eclectic and multifaceted sort of post-Marxist way of thinking about society, as Perry Anderson observed, the emphasis shifted away from the pragmatics and the exigencies of class struggle towards a critique of social factors that Marx had and his orthodox followers had called superstructural, notably literature, the arts, radio and cinema. Television wasn't yet a thing. Popular music and propaganda. The Frankfurt School had an immense appetite for these things, especially in the first generation. And they deemed them to be far more consequential in perpetuating the status quo than Marx had ever imagined. Marx said, oh, that's just the superstructure. We've got to focus on the base. He said, no, actually the superstructure is part of what holds this whole thing together. And so, with the help of Erich Fromm, who was the only clinician amongst the Institute's faculty, Horkheimer and associates attempted to develop this Marx-Freud synthesis I spoke of a moment ago to account for the failure of the working class to inaugurate the transition to a classless society. Now, the critical theorists all through the 30s continued to cling to Enlightenment ideals, the ideals of equality, emancipation, but Horkheimer and associates had witnessed the galloping Nazification of Germany at close quarters, and they were therefore quite critical of the concept of progress. Unlike classical or orthodox Marxists who had no way of accounting for what was going on in their actual environment at the time, in Europe at the time. Horkheimer and Adorno in particular argued that scientific and technological progress often mask and facilitate collective regression to barbarism, and that these trends culminated in the Holocaust. This led to a rather gloomy philosophy of history, which was quite unlike Marx's. Marx's was full of tragedy and conflict, but it had a happy ending. There's no guaranteed happy endings in critical theory. So critical theory's attitude towards the Enlightenment could best be described as profoundly ambivalent, sharing the Enlightenment's ideals and their hopes for emancipation and fostering human equality and democracy, but notably lacking in any faith of the ability of relentless scientific and technological innovation to bring it all about, which is what Condorcet had promised. And it's a promise that Marx took on board. He took it seriously. He believed that scientific and technological revolutions were hastening the advent of the revolution. And of course, Horkheimer and Adorno and their colleagues had to sort of essentially turn their back on that assumption. Now, though he made a substantial contribution to the Frankfurt School's early development, Erich Fromm severed ties with his erstwhile colleagues at the Institute for Social Research in 1938. And 1 year later, on the eve of Hitler's invasion of Poland, Freud published another very consequential and important book, Moses and Monotheism. Following the lead of the celebrated Viennese archaeologist Ernest Sellin, Freud speculated that the Israelites had murdered Moses at Sinai for interfering with their idolatrous rites and devotions, and then atoned for it afterwards, atoned for their parricidal deed afterwards by venerating him and turning his religion into theirs, thereby reenacting an Oedipal drama that supposedly first occurred in what Freud had referred to as the primal horde in his book Totem and Taboo in 1913. Freud's theory of the primal horde is linked to what he calls our phylogenetic inheritance, okay, which is in some ways quite analogous to Jung's theory of the collective unconscious, except that it's constellated entirely around the Oedipus complex and its derivative manifestations. Freud's book, Moses and Monotheism, was on firmer ground when, following the celebrated historian Solomon Reinach, Freud contended that it was not Jesus, but Paul, who really founded the Christian religion by developing the concept of original sin. Following Reinach, Freud claimed that Paul had laid the foundations for Christianity by borrowing motifs from mystery cults of pagan antiquity, and that he and the other church fathers had substituted what was essentially a son and mother-centered religion for the older father-centered religion of the Jews. In Freud's own words, and I'll give you a brief quote from Moses and Monotheism now. In certain respects, Freud says, the new religion was a cultural regression as compared with the older Jewish religion. This happens regularly when a new mass of people of a lower cultural level affects an invasion of or is admitted to an older culture. The Christian religion did not keep to the lofty intellectual heights to which the Jewish religion had soared. The former was no longer strictly monotheistic. It took over the surrounding people's numerous symbolical rites, reestablished the great mother goddess in the person of Mary, and found room for many deities of polytheism in an easily recognizable disguise, albeit in subordinate positions, as saints. Anyway, and that's the end of the quote from Freud. But please note, nowadays, though it was considered quite controversial at the time, nowadays the prevailing consensus among biblical scholars, both Jewish and Christian and non-religious or irreligious, is that Reinach was right, that Paul was indeed the true founder of the Christian faith, that Jesus was born and died a Jew, and that the hostile separation of faiths that occurred during the first century under Hellenistic influence has obscured that fact for many, if not most, Christian believers over the millennia, over the centuries. So Freud was, according to the prevailing consensus nowadays, was right in following Reinach in this. His contention that Judaism is a more rational religion than Christianity is much harder to defend. In fairness to Freud, this was actually a fairly common belief amongst assimilated Jews who had embraced the Enlightenment and had hoped for equality and emancipation in Europe, in vain, but at any rate. It probably arose as a kind of collective rejoinder to the widespread belief amongst European Christians that Judaism is deeply deficient in spirituality. So Christians blamed the fact that the Jews had rejected Jesus as the Messiah on a deficiency of spirituality and a deficit of spirituality. And Jews said, well, you're deficient in reason. Well, not all Jews, not Orthodox Jews, but certainly Jews in the Enlightenment mold, of whom Freud was one. So it's somewhat tangential to our inquiry, but it's interesting to note that Jung shared the belief that was widespread in Europe that the Jewish people are spiritually deficient. He says this pretty much straightforwardly in the Red Book. Although he seldom said this publicly, he tended to confide his musings on this score to his notebooks and his personal correspondence. And there's plenty of evidence of that in his notebooks and personal correspondence, much less in his published work. So, I mean, I don't know, I haven't read the collected works myself. I haven't read everything that he wrote, but in those books that I have read, I haven't found direct evidence of this. But this is a side issue. Our question now is, how did the Frankfurt School respond to Moses and monotheism, and what difference does it make? Horkheimer and Adorno's most famous and most influential book is The Dialectic of Enlightenment, which was published in 1947 and was profoundly influenced by Moses and monotheism. However, Horkheimer and Adorno downplayed the specifically Oedipal motifs and themes that animated Freud's fertile imagination and focused instead on the mythical figure of Odysseus, whom they took to be emblematic of the ascendancy of what they called instrumental reason, which promotes the growth and proliferation of science and technology, but undermines the cultural bases for human solidarity, and which culminated, they said, in the horrors of the Holocaust. Beyond that, chapter 5 of The Dialectic of Enlightenment, the most famous and influential book written by Horkheimer and Adorno, which is entitled Elements of Anti-Semitism, Limits of the Enlightenment. It's also indebted to Moses and monotheism, and more specifically, to the concept of cultural regression that Freud introduced there. Now, in our volume, which Critical Theory and Psychoanalysis, from the Frankfurt School to Contemporary Critique, Paul Bishop's essay, entitled Analytical Psychology and the Dialectic of Enlightenment, performs a very close reading of Dialectic of Enlightenment from a Jungian perspective, and calls attention to many illuminating parallels between Horkheimer and Adorno's concept of myth and Jung's ideas. Needless to say, I don't believe that either Jung on the one hand or Horkheimer and Adorno on the other would have welcomed these comparisons, and they would have had great difficulty acknowledging the parallels that exist, but there they are. And the fact is that Horkheimer and Adorno believe that modernity is also unwittingly infused and animated by myth, including, but not limited to, the myth of progress. Fromm's response to Freud was different, however, than those of Horkheimer, Adorno, and Marcuse. As Roland Pinchas observes, Fromm did not believe, for example, as Freud claimed, that Moses was Egyptian, nor did he believe, as Freud claimed, that the Israelites had murdered him in the wilderness. And while Fromm's first publication, entitled The Sabbath, which appeared in 1926, was a straightforward application of Freud's theory of the Oedipus complex to the ritual and symbolism of the Sabbath, his orthodox Freudian phase didn't last all that long. In fact, in an essay entitled The Dogma of Christ, which appeared in 1930, the year that Horkheimer took the helm at the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, Fromm completely rejected Freud's theory of our phylogenetic inheritance, which Freud sometimes refers to as our archaic inheritance. And remember, Freud's archaic inheritance construed the Oedipus complex as the core complex around which all religious ideation and all patterns of social and cultural development are constellated at higher and higher levels. You could make a case that he had a sort of a dialectical evolutionary perspective on it, but it's the Oedipus complex is always at the core of it or at the base of it. Now, by contrast, so Fromm rejected Freud's theory of the archaic inheritance. Adorno and Marcuse, by contrast, fervently embraced it. Marcuse, in particular, argued that Freud's theory of the archaic inheritance was inadvertently what he called the most revolutionary aspect of Freud's work. Where they converge is on the things they don't address from Totem and Taboo. Neither Fromm nor Adorno and Marcuse attempted to explore or explain Freud's personal identification with Moses, which many authors have noted, which was vivid and intense, and which actually has been written about at considerable length outside of the Frankfurt School circles. And they didn't. Neither of them speculated on the birth or the death of Moses, to my knowledge. And Freud's book is rife with speculation, which has so far not been, I mean, none of it's proven. Freud's book is rife with speculation about the birth and death of Moses. Let's continue. In our volume, the issue of Freud's archaic inheritance and its influence on Horkheimer and Adorno was addressed with great clarity and insight by my friend and former pupil, Frank Pittenger, in an essay called Recapitulation of the Vicissitudes of Progress from Freud to the Frankfurt School. It's subtitled The Germ of Regression. And there is, although it's not obvious to people who don't read these things side by side, there is a through line from the biogenetic law of Ernst Haeckel, whom Freud cites approvingly on many occasions, through Freud's work to the Frankfurt School, and their thoughts in Dialectic of Enlightenment on the problem of cultural regression. So Frank Pittenger's paper is quite, it's a very worthwhile read for anyone interested in Freud's theory of the archaic inheritance or the theme of cultural regression. Gary Clark wrote an essay entitled The Evolutionary Anthropology of Erich Fromm, the Frankfurt School, Second Nature, and the Existential Crisis of Consciousness. Gary calls our attention to many parallels between Erich Fromm's ideas about the nature of the psyche, about human prehistory and cultural development, and Jung's ideas on these same issues. These are parallels that often go unnoticed because Fromm and Jung were actually quite critical of each other and privately somewhat dismissive of each other's work. But Gary, again, does a very fine job of showing the parallels and convergences in their thought patterns. And this is easily the best treatment I've read on the subject, and I've read a few. John White's paper is entitled Colonizing the American Psyche, Virtue, and the Problem of Consumer Capitalism. And it draws both on Fromm and the Frankfurt School's critiques of consumer capitalism, which we unfortunately haven't the time to address in depth or detail today. But he demonstrates convincingly how advanced capitalist society undermines our capacity for deep personal reflection, for individuation and personal transformation, both in and outside the clinical situation, as was the case with Paul and Gary's papers. The parallels that emerge between the Frankfurt School and Jungian theory, as John presents it, are quite striking and in a certain sense, I would say, long overdue. So to the best of my knowledge, John and I are the first, and John Mills and I are the first and so far the only editors to invite Jungian scholars, Paul Bishop, Gary Clark, John White, to reflect on the legacy of the Frankfurt School. I don't think you'll find any other anthology or any other volume where this happens. Their efforts have vindicated, Paul, Gary, and John's efforts have vindicated our belief that Jungian scholars can contribute quite significantly to the literature on critical theory, and hopefully enrich the Jungian field in the process as well. And they can, and Jungian scholars can do this no matter how belatedly they come to this project. And I believe in every case, for Gary, John, and not sure about Paul, they did come to this interest fairly late in their careers. My hope is that other Jungian scholars will take note and will follow in their footsteps, and also contribute to the legacy of the Frankfurt School and to reflection on the legacy of the Frankfurt School in Jungian circles. But in the meantime, I wish to extend my congratulations to Paul, Gary, and John on their fruitful and illuminating efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So before we get into discussion, I hope to not bore you with my piece. When one of my areas of scholarship is in Hegel studies, and one of my early books was actually the first book to show, I believe, in a cogent manner and systematic way, how Hegel had actually anticipated the whole field of psychoanalysis. From not only Freud, but also Jung, the notion of a collective unconscious is very much part of the notion of a universal spirit. And I won't get into every detail of Hegel's work, but it's, first of all, it's very difficult to even read him without either thinking he's psychotic or you going crazy. But he had a very systematic philosophy, and the lesser known elements of his philosophy was that he had a rich theory of psychology and of what he calls the anthropology of the soul. And this is where really the birth of human spirit is, that gives rise to the greater structures of society that and culture that of course critical theory has come to critique. But most people know Hegel for the section on the master-slave dialectic in the phenomenology of spirit. And this is where some contemporaries, such as Axel Honneth in critical theory, have taken up and have used it to apply the notion of recognition to society. And he has a very, in my opinion, a very optimistic view of human nature, that we can somehow recognize everyone. Now, I love that idea, and I think there's an incredibly important element to it. However, because I'm a pessimist by nature, I just do not see that fitting in with the way people actually are, let alone social collectives. So there's always going to be a dialectical tension, I think. So what I wanted to do is kind of try to introduce in a digestible way the notion of recognition and the difficulty we have with it, but how it's also it's integral to how our unconscious works. So let me do that, and then hopefully we can open this up to a discussion. Arguably, one of the most widely cited sections of the phenomenology of spirit is Hegel's discussion of lordship and bondage. In pithy form, spirit or mind, Geist, ultimately achieves ethical self-consciousness only by recognizing the other as an equal being. But this is a developmental achievement. In our intersubjective exchange and engagement with others, there's a battle for recognition that takes place between subjects. Yet at first, parties in this struggle are unaware that they're looking for recognition. It's unconscious, and it's unconsciously mediated. Hence, the meaning of which is initially unclear to those involved. It is only through the process of confronting otherness that we become cognizant of what we truly want. We may observe how this is ontologically infused in all spheres of life and plays a key role in our psychological health and social progress. For every human being, wants to be recognized by others as an instantiation of human desire. This naturally extends to society. Before society raises itself to the status of improving its cultural practices for the sake of its peoples, including institutionalized ethics, law and order, and distributive justice, it must start with this basic psychic fact. Those who are deprived of recognition suffer and are condemned to harbor grave feelings of invalidation of their personhood and virtual aloneness. In days of serfdom and feudalism that existed in the high Middle Ages, people were ruled by autocracy and aristocracy, of which recognition was merely a one-way relation. The governing lord was recognized and the serf did the recognizing. In fact, this was a matter of life or death. Fear and despair kept one alive by obedience and subservience to potentially a cruel master. Hegel believes the struggle over being acknowledged is a necessary one in order to be truly independent and free, as the odyssey of pure self-consciousness, that's social awareness, is a progressive unfolding of recognizing its own ethical nature, unified in self-knowledge as a higher truth and culmination of civilized social life. In other words, true recognition by society requires collective reason and action, where all people are seen, theoretically and pragmatically, as equal, hence comprising and participating in and of a society or the state, harmonized in egalitarian principles, and as such constitutes the will of the people. But this is not the case for all societies. As we may plainly see in our world governed by violence, chaos, proto-fascism, dictatorship, despotism, and oppression of the masses, absolute self-consciousness, what Hegel calls, namely Enlightenment society, remains merely an abstract ideal, especially for non-democratic nations. Regardless of the limits of human societies within today's climate of globalization, failing to unite individuals, ethnic groups, and disparate cultures in a collective ethos, Hegel's theory of recognition has tangible, applied concrete merits. In fact, the problem of recognition may constitute the majority of the world's ills today. From the cradle to the grave, the child wants the love, emotional attunement, validation, and acceptance that only a parent can afford. Just as a parent wants reciprocal acknowledgement for their role in raising their child, as well as forgiveness for their imperfections, even in the final moments while lying in their deathbed. This speaks to a universal theory of human nature. So why does most of the world live in negation of this collective need, where radical splitting is instituted and alterity signals the proclivity to deny, withhold, aggress upon, and deracinate the other? Although this phenomenon is complex and overdetermined, let us return to basics using Hegel as our guide. People are unreflexively seen as being mere objects, as things that exist out there, out in the world, because they're divorced from our emotional and personal lives in order for us to psychologically function. Or we'd all be basket cases. It's only when we contemplate the nature of this otherness that we are confronted with our own normativity. Others are and have a self that exists independently from me. What is this other? What does the other have that I don't have? What do I want? What do I lack that the other has? These questions lie on the sunrise of self-consciousness, because we are instantly made aware of the external reality of other human beings who are just like us in essence, although we have separate identities, personalities, and longings. We become aware of our desires through reflection upon and as projected onto the other. On the subject that stands before us, even though we see this other as an independent or impersonal object. When we recognize the other as a desirous and intentional being, we are immediately made aware of the subjectivity of the other, one we have an obligation to address. What does this other want? This leads us to one of Hegel's most important insights. When we confront otherness, we are entangled in desire and lack, which initiates a skirmish for recognition. This is where Lacan stole, purloined right from Hegel and gave no credit. Who will be acknowledged in this mutual otherness? Here, subjectivities stand fundamentally opposed to one another. Now, Hegel pushes the issue further and forces us to face a most grave predicament. When mutual opposition confronts each other, quote, each seeks the death of the other, end quote. This understandably creates a crisis situation. Who will be defeated? In our contemporary world of cutthroat competition, economic exploitation and rivalry, political dominion, legal intervention, military strategizing, and transgovernmental maneuvering of hegemonic politics and policies, which ideology will win out over others? One side must acknowledge that they are weaker and the other stronger. So when posturing and rhetoric fail, a natural deference ensues, much like what we see in the animal kingdom, governed by evolutionary currents. One must bow down and accept their inferiority and servitude, while the other maintains the status of victor. What used to be a literal fight to the death is now largely a symbolic one, depending upon where you live or come from. Genocide, like right now, whether in the past was Rwanda or Sierra Leone, Myanmar, the Democratic Republic of Congo, are cordial reminders in recent decades of what can happen when power differentials implode. But this happens on a more pedestrian plane every day, everywhere in the world. People want respect. When they are dismissed or insulted, they emotively react with counter contempt and rancor. If not, narcissistic rage and the need to devalue or shame the other in the heat of the moment. This can even precipitate violence and the need for revenge due to wounded pride. From Trump to fake news, denial over the pandemic, and a gullible, inane public, we're living in precarious times of transition and outright stupidity. What is often recognized is not the equality of the other, but rather a scornful inequality, namely the narcissistic fact that people often do not care about alterity over their own lives and self-interest, to the point that the other becomes a dangerous threat to one's safety. Although we may acknowledge that others are independent persons, it does not mean that, as Hegel would say, we respect others as persons, end of quote. On the contrary, respect is earned. Avoidance, withdrawal, and submissiveness, on the other hand, are defensive modes of self-survival, especially in the face of a powerful opponent. Do our world societies, what Hegel calls objective spirit or Jung's collective psyche, instantiated in the state, think about the common universal good for all, or merely their own self-regard and political pressures invested in their own nation and communities? Despite there may be checks and balances designed to help treat citizens fairly, this does not generalize to a universal society of cosmopolitans, namely citizens of the cosmos, who value all human life equally. Of course, such hypostatization of a so-called collective mind only makes sense as an abstract conception that embodies the spirit of democracy, as imperfect as this may be. But when it comes down to actualizing a universal good, humanity becomes a multiple personality split in its desires, needs, conflicts, and demands, as well as dissatisfactions. There's always a tension between the individual and the collective that stands in relation to pure freedom versus ideality as a good for all. We should never presuppose that we have the same values and opportunities to pursue and obtain life goals equally, for we all have different historicities and restrictions that condition the developmental, ontic, cultural, material, and economic substrates that in turn curtail our opportunities, liberties, worldviews, and outcomes. So when Hanneth says that a distributational schema of justice, quote, would have to be replaced by the involvement of all subjects in a given relationship of recognition, end quote, this seems to violate human nature. Not all people are disposed, let alone capable of recognizing the other. We may have to contend that in the end, recognition means tolerance of difference and not merely acceptance of the other, which could still bring about a pragmatic coexistence, even if people cannot recognize each other as equals. In today's society, we live in fear of death for looking at someone the wrong way, of seeing their desire for what you are imagined to possess or what they lack and want, to the point that you could be mugged for the change in your pockets, raped at whim, or shot in the face just because someone didn't like the way you looked at them. The gaze, the look, the stare is an invitation to aggression. We are instinctively obsequious and show assent or acquiesce when we are afraid. We avoid the face of the other, hence look away, dodge confrontation, and yield. Conversely, just as we look for conflict, seek out a fight, hate the other just for being other, and retaliate and perceive defeat simply because we have the need to find foes. Some object must become a designated whipping post as a form of displacement. Eye aversion is the best way to evade engaging with the other. Simply a faceless entity that is deemed a threat worth avoiding, yet one already identified as a powerful object for inducing fear in the first place. We can sniff out their aggression, their malice, their negativity, and so-called intuitive evil propensities. Disavowal and dissociation become common defenses. The other is as alien to us as we are to them, and we hope that they will just leave us alone, if not disappear. In the face of conflict, we simply want the other to vanish. But what happens when the other wants something from us or demands our recognition, let alone restitution, as if it were a right? Our proverbial backs go up. Yet the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in response to apartheid, the scandal over the US Federal Chinese Exclusion Act in interning Japanese Americans in World War II, as well as First Nations children in Christian residential schools in Canada, and the process of family members publicly addressing and sometimes forgiving murderers openly in courts of law, such as with the organization Murder Victims' Families for Reconciliation, show how recognition has healing properties. But it does not undo injustice. Inequality and disparities are everywhere. We all have to get in line before acknowledged, let alone recognized. Some as subjects in their own right, but mostly as objects wanting something from others, equally viewed as things in mutual opposition. Here the notion of equality by some may be seen as entitlement by others, which challenges the status quo at the same time the establishment offers its own political offensives. We develop our defenses, some cynical, caustic, stoic, and/or emotionless, others manic and counter-aggressive, in order to deal with the other's demands and in facing our own lack. Envy, jealousy, passive aggressiveness are common dispositions. Protest and violence are eruptions of frustration, sometimes fueled by paranoid relations. Facing alterity always involves an interpersonal negotiation between mutual conflict, competing values, emotional prejudices, and privileged self-serving agendas. This takes place in all facets of society, as it does in the consulting room. So I'll stop there with that. Leave you on an optimistic note. Speaking of which, someone just threw a wine bottle through my front window. So getting quotes for a window has been on my weekend agenda. But it goes to show you the level of aggression, frustration that exists in society, because we caught the kid on external video cameras. We have no clue who it is. Just looks like a disgruntled teenager, just having his displacement heyday.
That's ending on an optimistic note, John.
Hi, Daniel.
Hi.
Well, we'll open it up for discussion. Anyone want to just pop in and ask a question, please do. Go ahead, Richard.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Daniel. Oh, what a great presentation. Thank you so much for doing this. Yeah, beautiful. I hope your paper's available, John. That was brilliant. Thank you. And I have purchased the book. You should tell Rutledge that after I buy 10 John Mills books, there should be one free. Something like that. Anyway, I have a whole bunch of questions, and I don't want to take up all this time. But I happen to notice, I just got the book and I'm reading it, and I just happened to notice that Donald Trump comes up quite a bit in this book. And I wonder what that's about. Why is he held up as a perhaps symbol or a figure of whatever? What's the deal with Donald Trump with you guys?
Well, just speaking for myself, Trump is an authoritarian populist who is now a former president. He wasn't at the time we were working on this, and I have to say I'm very relieved that that's no longer the case. I was quite concerned while he was president that he might win a second term, or as his presidency waned, that he might hold on to power through violence, which he did. He tried to do. I was fearful that Trump's ascendancy and his popularity signal what Freud and Horkheimer and Adorno refer to as cultural regression. You know, when you have masses of people rallying behind a malignant narcissist, who's always race baiting. I mean, that has conjures up eerie, disturbing parallels to Hitler. I'm not saying that Trump is Hitler, Okay, but there's something similar going on. I was worried that for most of the time we were working on this book, I was worried that American democracy was done for. Now, I'm still not convinced that we've won the battle. I mean, Joe Biden's presidency looks like it's going to go to a second term, but Obama had 2 terms, and that didn't stop Trump from getting elected. So this may just be an interlude, like a reprieve. I'm sure by now you can tell that I'm just as optimistic as John about culture. I mean, I'm not sure that we're not just in a moment of reprieve that brings a temporary halt to a slide into fascism. And for critical theorists, I mean, concern over the resurgence of fascism is always on the front burner. Whatever else may be, alongside of it, it's always on the front burner. So that's my response. John?
I really have nothing to add. He's in many ways just convenient person to pick on. But my chapters are not really addressing him in any way. It'd be other people. I can't even recall besides Daniel who wrote on Trump.
Lawrence, wow.
Yeah,
What's
well, thank you for a very comprehensive presentation. I'm wondering if you take up the notion of Lacan in terms of his work on the real, particularly, say, in Freud's dream, Father, don't you see I'm burning? The real behind that, and the way in which the capitalist discourse, to which we're all captive in this day and age, is really core to so many of the issues that you're addressing.
I have great difficulty trying to answer that question because I'm not sufficiently familiar with, I'm not familiar with Lacan's take on Freud's dream, number one, and I'd want to be before I weighed in.
Well, in Freud's dream, I mean, the later Lacan goes back and addresses what he speaks of in the 5th chapter of his Seminar 11, the 4 fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. But the notion is this, Father, don't you see I'm burning? There's something we don't want to see. And then when he speaks about the real and how we mask the real and don't want to know from the real and trauma and the ways in which the capitalist discourse in which everybody can go for their own quick fix without ever having to
I'm getting the
confront
flavor now. Yeah.
this traumatic nucleus. It just feels so core to the critical theory that you're addressing.
Yeah, I get what you're driving at now. Another source of reservation I had in attempting to answer your question, I'm still not going to try and answer it fully, though I do understand it better, is that I have serious issues with Lacan's epistemology about the symbolic, the imaginary, the real. I don't think it's grounded in Freud's understanding of how the psyche works. And I think that what many Lacanians do is they extrapolate from Lacan and use his ideas about the real very creatively, as you've just done. But the fact that the notion that the real can't be known or expressed in language is beyond, or is beyond representation. Also, it doesn't work for me. So with that said, what I hear you saying is that capitalism offers some very impressive palliatives for the pain and distress that it actually creates. And those are there to mask what's really going on. And so most of what's in consciousness is unreal. It's not, and it's disconnected from reality. That's the essence of what you're saying as I understand it. And I have to agree. I mean, I think that's a very, notwithstanding my reservations about Lacan's epistemology, I think you're absolutely right about that.
You know, Lacan addresses those three aspects, the symbolic, imaginary, and real, in each of Freud's case histories, and shows how Freud was very aware of each of these, even though he didn't use those terms. But it does come out in the case histories.
Mm-hmm.
And
Wow.
he does address this anyway.
Okay. Fair enough.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The catch-22 for me is that we all live in a capitalist world. And how can we escape it? I mean, this is our thrownness. And yet, to add to that, most of us here are well off. I mean, by contemporary standards, we're rich. And yet, if this is the only game in town, that we have to earn a living, but it does put us in positions of, we're being kind of torn in terms of our ethics and our identifications and our empathies with others. And naturally, it creates a great deal of ambivalence in society as well. I'm in Canada, and it seems to be an entirely different world than the United States. I mean, at least from my point of view, it's not nearly as polarized. It is a, extremely multicultural, country. It's very much embraced social democracy, socialized medicine, subsidized education, and with it comes higher taxes. But I mean, people are not left or right split. They are liberals. At least this is the current state of our political, office that's in party that's in office. But people are centrists, moderates. I mean, it's embraced, I think, a much different ethos than in the United States.
But it's still a capitalist society. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure, Robin.
Yeah. So I have a sense of how you might answer, but I don't want to imagine it further than that. And do either of you have a position on historical progress? I'm more familiar with Walter Benjamin's essays on, historical materialism. And you, Daniel, you mentioned that in the first generation of critical thinking. I'm wondering, and then John, you spoke of it through Hegel, through a Hegelian lens. But do you have a position on time's progression?
My position, I can state it very simply, is that ever since the end of the Reformation, the scientific and technological progress have been proceeding apace, but that there's been no fundamental change in human nature, and that all the advances that we've had in terms of societal progress and cultural progress seem to be matched by, and sometimes exceeded by, regressive Freud and Adorno and Horkheimer would call regressive movements, and we're caught up in a regressive vortex now in terms of world politics, more so in the United States than in Canada, perhaps, but certainly there's that there. So what I would say is that in the last couple of decades, as we've sort of started to slide into fascism, which is how which is what my overarching field is, I guess, science and technology have proceeded apace. Education has declined substantially in many ways, too many to enumerate right now. So, but science and technology, continue, and now we have AI to contend with. So I find Benjamin's philosophy of history and Horkheimer and Adorno's philosophy of history more realistic, more true. It's not comforting. It's not a comforting thought, but it's not meant to be. I mean, and maybe this gets back to Lawrence's point about how, capitalism sort of shields us from the real. We really are in a very, very bad place culturally and politically, and there are sources of hope. I mean, I'm not completely, I'm not despairing, and there are grounds for cautious optimism here and there. There's good stuff happening in the in the environmental sphere. There's some positive political developments in some parts of the world, but there's no necessary connection. Like the people of the Enlightenment thought that progress is necessarily linked to advances in science and technology and in public education, but that doesn't appear to be happening. And for the Frankfurt School, Nazi Germany proved that, beyond any shadow of doubt. Mm. So, I guess the way I see things is closer to theirs than it is to Condorcet or Marx. Although there's an element of utopianism in Honneth. I mean, Honneth really, as John pointed out, he appears to believe that you can have this kind of utopian meeting of minds. I mean, it's completely ignoring the what Freud called the aggressive dimension of human nature, which is also, greedy, aggressive, self-seeking. It's all those negative asocial and antisocial traits we prefer not to have, and especially prefer others not to have. But so that's, sorry for the rambling answer. I guess that's the best I can do.
Yeah. Thank you.
Lacan will talk about the missed encounter with the real, what we don't want to see.
Evangeline, you had a question.
Hello. Well, first of all, a comment. I thank you both very, very much for a truly educative endeavor. I love it. Of course, the very immature part of me would like to remove the word critical. I would like to replace it with essential, because I'm just a clinician, always trying to get past argument into dialogue. So I would just like to remove that word. Of course, that's very silly of me, but that's my first take on it. And thank you both very much for your complex and beautiful work. I just want to mention that Gandhi was very clear when he started Satyagraha that the people he was working for, the indigo planters in Bihar, were actually in such a poor condition, they could not help themselves. They were the workers who were starved, completely helpless in a way. And that's why he started his work, knowing that they could not help themselves. I just would like to add that as a side comment. And thank you both very much.
I'd like to respond briefly to your reflections on the word critical. The word critical nowadays has taken on a negative connotation. But for Horkheimer and Adorno, they were, Horkheimer in particular, was a reader of Kant, and Kant had called his philosophy critical philosophy. And he did not mean by that it's harping on people's faults or deficiencies. What he meant was it's rigorous, and it is attempts to get to the foundations. It attempts to the foundations of things. So what are the conditions for the possibility of human experience? Sort of the basic Kantian question. He called it critical. It didn't have the connotation it has in everyday colloquial English today, of being derisive or negativistic. So in today's context, I can understand why in today's context you wouldn't want that to use that word. But if you're thinking about why it was adopted in the first place, you have to transpose yourself into their frame of reference. Why did Horkheimer in particular and his colleagues pick up this word? It's because Kant and Hegel had a big influence on their thinking.
Yes, I thought your presentation clarified that very well. So I felt relieved. Thank you.
Good. Good. Danielle?
Yeah, hi, thank you again, both of you. So I would like to ask you how critical theory thinks about AI. And, you know, we're talking a lot about science and technology, authoritarianism. Many people, you know, AI is advancing at a breakneck speed. People are engaging with it. The gaze is coming from screens rather than people, John, more and more. What does that mean for us? But even more than that, AI has the ability to self-improve in a way that previous technologies and that we've created did not. Like even nukes could not, you know, create more nukes, but AI can improve AI. And it's becoming more intelligent, and many who are involved in the field are frightened of where it's taking us. So even, you know, we're talking about politics, but here I think we have to move to science and technology and see what the risks and dangers are there and how it's being used or it can be abused. So I would love to hear your thoughts about that, and with regard to how critical theory might be thinking about it. If it is thinking about it and discussing it, I would like to know.
About 10 years ago, Nick Burston wrote a book called Superintelligences. And he's anticipated the very thing that you're raising and what people in the field are worried about, that means a machine can take over, it's self-replicating, it's a matter of time, right, before one of these things is going to pass the Turing test. Yeah. And so his scenario is, of course, an end of the world scenario where doomsday happens because AI becomes super intelligent and can basically control the world or decide that humans are irrelevant and a threat to it. On one hand, is that a paranoid relation to machine intelligence? I'm not so sure. On the other hand, you would think that designers would put in fail safes in these things, that they would be limited. But all it takes is a evil scientist who
Yeah.
wants to create something for warfare purposes. And when you conjure up
Or
the-
even the machine itself that becomes evil or uses it for evil. We've seen certain robots who suddenly start spouting anti-Semitism or you know, things like that on their own.
I don't know what to say. I think it's kind of why I'll have to wait and see what develops. But it's certainly, I'm not going to dismiss the possibility that that we could enter into nuclear engagement because of AI taking over or going haywire. And even though I wasn't going to get into my apocalyptic views, I was telling Robin, you know, when you combined all these existential risks, such as the climate crisis, such as the overpopulation boom that's going to happen within 25 years, that you're going to deal with, you know, fascism. I think there's going to be World War III. I think it's just a matter of time before the whole planet will be forced to be in some kind of engagement to, you know, everything that could pressurize and be compounded, the economic disparities, the, yeah, I mean, I think we're on the brink of extinction. I hope I'm wrong.
Daniel? Do you have anything?
I wish that I had a more deep familiarity with the work of Adorno in particular. He's someone I've studied his work on authoritarianism very closely, and I've read Negative Dialectics years and years ago, and of course Dialectic of Enlightenment. But there's all this work that was done by the Frankfurt School on technology as a way of as a means for social control. The threat posed by AI is rather different, but it's not just AI. I mean, there's all kinds of I think Adorno would have some biting things to say about AI and see it as a tragic but inevitable outcome of capitalism. I certainly see it that way, but I don't claim to speak for all critical theorists. This is a problem with when you're talking about the first generation of critical theorists. They had, you know, what they said on the subject of fascism, creeping fascism, is still relevant today. But they didn't anticipate, you know, the laptop computer. They didn't anticipate AI. They didn't anticipate the environmental crisis we find ourselves in. So what would they have said? In the end, we're speculating. There are some speculations are better informed than others, but we don't really know. You know, I'm not going to really hazard another conjecture. I think that's what I think Adorno would say, that this is a necessary but inevitable outcome of the logic of capitalism, the triumph of the machine over man, over humanity, I should say. And I know that's what Erich Fromm would say. I mean, I do know Fromm's work deeply enough and well enough to know that. That's precisely what he would say. The triumph of the machine of humankind. Fromm was, by the way, a big fan of Lewis Mumford, who wrote a book in 1934 called Man and Machine, I think it was. And in 1934, Mumford predicted that human beings and machines would merge at some point further down the line. And he anticipated the transhumanist movement. Fromm talks about this but that's the it wasn't, transhumanism wasn't a thing when Fromm died in 1980. It was still sort of science fiction. Now it's an actual thing. People are actually trying to do that, to create cyborgs and so on. So, but anyway, those are my thoughts.
I think it's also a way of trying to transcend our own mortality and our limitations.
Yeah,
I see it from an existentialist perspective as well.
I would agree with that. It's an attempt to transcend mortality and in effect to abolish human existence as it currently exists. And
some people are actually saying that.
Yeah. The next
Google, Kurzweil, yeah.
So you see, for people, if people do manage to create cyborgs and that are effectively in constant rapport with all the machines around them, they may be, if AI were to take over, they might be instrumental in helping making that happen. They might be considered allies by AI rather than existential threats. And do you remember the Star Trek? I know I should be referring to science fiction, but remember the Borg in Star Trek, Second Generation, Next Generation? I mean, that could happen. That could be where we're heading. But that would mean the end of humanity as we
know it.
As we've experienced it, as we've celebrated and bemoaned it. It would be the end of human existence. It would be the beginning of something else, a post-human. That's why it's called post-humanism. Yeah.
Thank you.
And although again, no one's authorized me to speak on behalf of the first generation of Frankfurt theorists, but I know that they would have all deplored this development, the likely implications or consequences of these technological innovations.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. I'm mindful we're over, and we're grateful for Robin for putting this on for IAJS for us. So thank you very much, Robin.
Thank you, Robin.
Yeah.
And thank you everyone who attended.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Yes.
Take good care.
Daniel, John,
Thank you.
deeply thank you. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everyone. Hi, Ladson. Where'd you go? Can you hear me? Oh, well.